Hey everyone, thank you for joining us on this episode of the Women of Color Collectives podcast. This week, the topic is what womanhood means to you. I'm one of your hosts, Eden, here with my co-host Amina, and we are glad to have you here. So let's just get started with introductions. So if everyone could go around, give their name, their year, their pronouns, and how they identify. So I'll start. My name is Eden K. Sahun. I am a first year. I take the She series, and I identify as a cis woman.
Hi everyone, my name is Amina. I am a sophomore here at Harvard and I take the She series.
Hi, my name is Elise. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a first year here at the college and I identify as a cis woman.
Hi, my name is Alice. I'm a senior at the college and I also take she, her pronouns, and I'm also a cis woman.
Hi, my name is Bari. I am a first year at the college. I take she, her, and they, them pronouns, and I identify as a non binary person.
Hi everyone, I'm Audrey. I'm a first year at the college. I take the She series and I also identify as a cis woman.
All right, incredible. Thank you so much, y'all. So, the first question that we have for you is the $1,000,000 question. How do you define and embody womanhood in its entirety and full authenticity, either generally or as it pertains to you?
I find that womanhood can be a very complicated subject for me, especially because I don't exactly identify as a woman. Um, I more so identify with Black womanhood than I do with womanhood in general. The reason being is because I feel like womanhood is the basis of womanhood is so has been defined by white supremacy in a lot of ways, and I don't necessarily resonate with that, but I present outwardly as a woman, and I feel like no matter what I do, society will always perceive me as a Black woman, and I will always be treated as such. And so, in a lot of ways, I retain that title, but in certain ways, I don't.
Yeah, I think like a lot of the themes that you brought up resonate with me, and that womanhood is not this mold that I embody by fitting completely into it and whatnot. I think part of it is how I'm read by others and what that does to me. But another part of it is, at the Women's Center, we talk about gender as a constellation, just a messy, diverse way of intersection of all the things that make you who you are. And there is no one definition of womanhood that I either do or don't embody. For me it's just that is what I'm most comfortable labeling myself as, because I exist at this intersection of so many different things. So yeah, that's kind of, I guess, abstractly thinking how I think about it.
Yeah, I'll jump in next. So, um, I'll take it in like a bit of a different direction, but as a woman who is interested in like STEM related fields and fields that are typically male dominated, I think that I spent a lot of my life, especially in my education, trying to hide my femininity or my womanhood, thinking that it might make me lesser or less valid than my like male counterparts. But recently, like coming to this institution where there are just so many like strong women in academia and just surrounding myself with other women like me has made me honestly really proud of my womanhood. And so I completely agree that it's a totally like self-defined thing, and how you choose to express that or exemplify that is very much a personal choice. And for me, I think just like being proud to be a woman in STEM and in male dominated fields is personally like a way that I like love expressing my womanhood.
Yeah, I feel like, a very interesting relationship with womanhood. I grew up in a family with two dads and a wonderful young sibling who identifies as non binary. And so I have grown up in a family that womanhood hasn't always been the biggest topic of conversation. I feel like I haven't had as many female role models in my life to help shape me along the path, along the road that has led me to the woman that I am today. But I think that self discovery and tapping in, talking to other women, and like forming relationships with other women has been like one of the most impactful things for me on that journey, and like help form who I am today. So even without having a strict definition of what womanhood has been in my life, I have been able to, I hope, become a strong woman and be able to confidently identify with that. Even when as a child, I wasn't always able to be super strong in that identity.
Okay, those were all amazing answers. So, along the lines of what Elise just said, did you have strong role models of your gender identity in your life, and how did that affect you?
I would certainly say that my mom was a very strong role model for me because I always saw her working. My parents came to the United States in the early 2000s from Nigeria, and they really built what they had from nothing in a lot of ways. And I didn't realize it at the time. I don't think I appreciated it as much as I should have at the time. But the older that I got, the more I like grew to realize how much like work my mom actually puts in, both into her professional career and into her family. Um, I do think that if I were to be able to go back and do it all again, I wish my mom would be in a position where she didn't have to actually work as hard. I think that there's something that should be said for that, in the especially within like immigrant families and this culture of like working until you physically break your own body down with the hopes of like your children being better. And while I understand why it is the way that it is right now, and I understand why my parents did what they did, it does make me kind of sad. Because I wish that like the quality of life that I have now could have been afforded to them at the time that I was growing up. Um, but yeah.
Yeah, I agree 100% because my parents are also immigrants, and I think like my mom and also my sister, my older sister, are probably my two biggest women role models. But I also wish that societally speaking too, like there were just more images, like for me as an Asian American woman, like more role models for me to look at and see, oh, this is a path of life that I could also pursue instead of only, you know, like my own family working at a nail salon or um, being expected to fill the stereotype, you know, all these harmful stereotypes. So I just wish that while I'm so grateful to have had personal role models in my life, you know, teach me how to keep my head down and also how to like really humble me also as a kid, which now, especially being at Harvard, I think is such a great character trait to have. um, I just wish that, like, societally speaking, and entertainment and politics and, you know, sports and anything, like, everywhere, I think I wish I had other role models to see and learn from, and maybe think maybe if I had like a sports person to look up to, I would be an athlete today. God knows, right? So yeah, I 100% resonate with what you were saying about the whole immigrant narrative trapping some people.
Yeah, so kind of like I mentioned earlier, I feel like I have struggled to find personal um, role models of my life surrounding womanhood. I always had wanted a mom in so many ways. I love my parents so much, but there's something about having a woman in your life, and especially when I hear stories of my friends going out, getting their nails done, or going to the store and finding things. I just was never able to go and do that as well. And so I just always remember like stumbling around trying to find like what do you get, what are menstrual products, like what are those things. But then I realized that stumbling around, not knowing your way, like that is part of womanhood. Like, and then I found just like little moments of like this is womanhood in things that don't even pertain to like women necessarily, stumbling around not knowing like how to interact with friends, trying to make friends. That's a part of womanhood. And so even without those super strong role models, I was able to take bits and pieces of people who identify as women, people who don't identify as women, and take little pieces to help get my picture of what womanhood is. And that is part of why I see it as such a broad and beautiful category.
Yeah, at least thank you so much for sharing. I think that's really incredible. And that's like such a unique way of looking at it. And I'm really glad that you shared that. Um, and I so strongly align with everything that Allison Barry said in terms of like having immigrant parents and immigrant mother, and just kind of, I think, a story that really encapsulates the way I look up to my mom and my mom's role as a Chinese woman, an East Asian woman, which typically was a role that was very much like, denounced and like just kind of relegated to the housewife or like taking care of the kids. But in like especially East Asian culture, only sons are allowed to carry the family name. So girls will receive like a, name with characters that are typically deemed like pretty or cute, but it doesn't get passed on to anyone. They don't get to like continue the family line because they're seen as like husband's property once they get married. So when I was born, there were some like more traditional leading members of my family who did not want to give me a family name, and they just kind of wanted to follow the typical Chinese tradition of just like naming out the characters and having a name that wasn't going to live on. But my mom insisted that I get part in the family name and that I am able to carry that. And so my name today, I have the same first two characters as my brother, which to me is just really significant. And it's one of my favorite stories to tell because just her taking those steps and standing up against all of these norms in Chinese culture that she was really like pressured with, for her to like take a stance against that and say like my daughter will have a family name and that's just the way that I'm insisting it's going to be. That is really really special to me, and for that reason like my mom is a massive like woman role model in my life.
That is incredible. Thank you so much for sharing, all of you. So my next question for you all, very connected to actually your story right now, Audrey. So did you grow up in a family or culture where gender norms were heavily enforced? And how did that affect you?
Oh man, I could go in on this one. So as I mentioned before, my parents are Nigerian, and Nigerian culture can be very, very like traditional. And so when I was younger, me and my parents, more so with my dad specifically, my mom was a lot more lenient. Um, we had to tussle a little bit because there were some like gender norms that they were trying to put in place that like wasn't sitting right with me. Like when I was started to get older, not even like become a teenager or anything like that, but like in my later like young child years, my parents would always like start making me clean and like do things, and I didn't understand like why I was doing them and why my brother wasn't doing them. And then when I finally like started to get older and I had like the words to like really articulate what it was that I felt, um, it was a bit of a tense time, not gonna lie, because my parents would say things like, "Oh, like you need to be in the kitchen with your mom, helping her how to cook, because like it's your place as a woman to learn how to do these things." And I will not lie, I did not learn how. I learned how to like. I did not learn how to cook out of spite. Because I was like,
I regret it a little bit.
No, just
don't know how to cook,
but no, same. Like now, I do have to figure it out, and it's a bit of a struggle. I do have to look up the YouTube videos to find my way. But like, I think at the time, I was just very like there was a lot of frustration because I didn't understand why it was that I had to be relegated to like certain roles just because I look the way that I look and I present the way that I do. And my parents have since learned now that I'm a lot older, and we've had like numerous conversations about it. But I found that like the journey to get here wasn't like exactly the most easiest one, and that's just because that's how they were raised.
I so strongly feel that is the whole like not learning how to cook out of spite thing, and it's like really coming back to bite me now. But you know what? We'll deal with it. We'll learn. But kind of like a similar, but almost like flip side to that story is my mom is a phenomenal cook. Like, if you want good Chinese food in Michigan, you just like have to go to her. There's like no other choice. So growing up, like my mom was always in the kitchen and she was always cleaning around the house. And I think I honestly struggled a lot with that growing up because similarly, like I had moments of, why is my mom always the one cooking? Why is my mom always the one cleaning? But I'm really, really close with my mom. And the more I talked to her, the more I realized that, like, this was a personal choice that she had made. And this was the way that she wanted to contribute to the family. And in addition to that, she also worked a like full-time professional job. She has made significant progress up the corporate ladder, and so to me she was always kind of like this goddess of someone who is able to like really do both and just make like incredible contributions to both her work life and her home and family life. And so like it was really refreshing for me to see that she was not being pressured into this role of being like a woman in the house, but instead this was something that she was like taking on and like really just internalizing because cooking is something that she loves and she really enjoys, and yet at the same time she's also able to balance like such a fulfilling and successful work life. And so for me, I think that was a really nice way of seeing like the norms balance out with what like women are really capable of in like a professional or something that's like not traditionally viewed as feminine setting.
My mom is also, she's not like the best cook, but I like her food. But my dad is actually, like my parents run a restaurant together and my dad cooks there, but he doesn't cook at home. So it's the act of, paid cooking that allows him to cook in the workplace but not at home. And, you know, I always saw that growing up where my dad was it's just me, my older sister, and my mom and my dad. So he's the only man of the house, but he did kind of have like the head of the table, and he makes a joke that he's afraid of his daughters, but really in terms of a bigger scope of power, he has a lot of it. And I think part of it comes from the fact that they grew up in Korea at a time where those gendered power dynamics helped their like was a part of their survival really, and the way of life that they had to live in order to survive and in order to, not saying that, not justifying that obviously, but that was just the way that they had learned. And my parents similarly have since learned with two very opinionated daughters that we won't be living that same life, but yet at the same time I think it's it's a little scary to think about how much of that is have I absorbed too. Um, but yeah, I think I don't even know where I'm going with this, but it's just really a little scary to think about what gender norms you inherit when personally I want to be more like liberate myself from this, very binary notion of gender. But yeah.
I often saw this play out, especially in terms of the heteronormativity of conversations that I would have in my schools, with my parents, with everybody. Even in a family with, two dads, I have found that like any conversation about dating and relationships has often started with talking about a boy. And so I think that is a dynamic that I feel like we as a society still need to absolutely work on is how are we actually challenging heteronormativity, especially as it relates to women, because that does have a lot to do with those gender power imbalances. So that's how I've seen it a lot play out in my home life, and then also just in like my culture. I mean, I guess like I'm from Vermont, which is very it's very white. It's very beautiful, and there's a lot of beautiful things there. But I do find that I was often surrounded by a lot of other like white students or blonde hair, and I feel like that was really hard for me as a person of color. I identify as mixed, as Afro Latina, and that was always really difficult just looking at the imaging. And I think that the media portrayed a lot of what I understood when it came to gender dynamics and as well as self-image. So I think that also makes me think that it's really important to change the media too. I remember as a child watching all of the Disney princess movies and feeling like my family is never in there. I never see any family that looks like me. I've never seen a princess that looks like me. And at the same time, looking at the screen and saying, why are all the villains, why are they more thin, or why are they more like overweight? And then just like, why are they often darker skinned um, than their heroic counterparts? And so I think that when that's the imaging that I was portrayed as a child, I think that that calls into question, what are we doing now for our future generations, so that other kids like me who maybe have different dynamics in their family will actually get a positive picture of what womanhood can be.
That was amazing. And I feel like once again, that transitions really well into our next question. How do media depictions of womanhood, misrepresentations, or erasure of your identity affect your construction of your identity?
I kind of touched on this earlier when I was talking about role models, but not having much depiction really limited my understanding of what I could do with my life. Because when the narrative you're being told is constantly, you have to be a lawyer, you have to go, or you have to be a doctor, you have to go into STEM, you have to do well in school, or else, like, how could you possibly be Asian otherwise, right? um, that was just always really hard for me to deal with because I was never really interested in that. I also think it speaks a lot to our our just horrible education system. Anyways, I think grades shouldn't exist. Anyways, whatever. Um, but yeah, it just limits your understanding of what you can be, and um, and I think for me also when I did see some representation of Asian American women, it was always through a lens of like fetishization. And especially as someone who really struggled with internalized misogyny and body image issues, like I was always so frustrated, A, that I didn't fit into that mold, but B, looking back at it, like that was also just so harmful for Asian American women, point blank, period, no matter who you are. So that was always just so frustrating to me, not having, I don't know, like actors in Hollywood be Asian and have really diverse and like depth to them, right? Other than being like the nerdy, geeky character or the housemaid, right? I think that just for me taught me that to be an Asian woman basically was the only information I got was from my parents of how they defined what my life possibilities should be. So that was really hard to free myself from. And I think now even as like a senior, it's a little daunting to think about what I should do after I graduate because now the field, like the world is technically my oyster. I could do whatever I want, but I don't know what I should do or what I want to do because I never had the time as a kid really to explore those possibilities when it didn't when there were no stakes behind that exploration. Now I have to choose and be paid for it. So, you know, I think that was really costly.
I have so many snaps for what Alice said. I just like resonated so strongly with all of that. And I think that really just speaks to like whether for better or for worse, the like woman of color or the East Asian woman experience in America can be so universal. Um, and like being a woman of color is really kind of like a double whammy. Like we're all dealing with so many things, so many stereotypes and pressures that are coming at us from all different directions. And as like one individual person, that's really hard to deal with. So yeah, but like jumping back into like the media and representation kind of thing, um, I cannot emphasize how many times I've been told by separate people, like, you look so much like Sandra Oh, or like Constance Wu, or like whichever, latest East Asian actress had been, like popular or on the rise. Um, and like, especially with me being interested in medicine, I've kind of always wondered what that was the result of. Is it like, do I really want to do medicine, or is this just something that I felt pressured to do my whole life? And especially when I like made the decision to come here, I think that's something I struggled with a lot. But being away from the I guess like culture and environment that I grew up in has really like solidified my interest in medicine as, okay, now I'm recognizing that this is something that I was not pressured into doing, but something that I myself am really like committed to doing. And like making that realization was a huge step for me. And I think the fact that I had to make that realization at all is a little disappointing, because, kids should just be able to have dreams and ideas about what they want to do and not experience any of this strange internal conflict about, is this what society and media and even my family sometimes, like requires me to do, or is this something that I truly want to do? And like going back to what Alice said about media representation is, like adding on, I think it's phenomenal that we've had such an increase of like people of color representation in media, film, pop culture. The one thing is that I wish it would stop being framed in the context of people of color. I think certain topics, obviously, yes, should have like an emphasis on people of color, but sometimes, it feels like Asian people or Black people or Hispanic people are included in a film or a TV show just to be there, or like just to meet the diversity quota, or just to, like fill this role. Or sometimes, films are like made with a very like Asian centric cast just to have an Asian centric cast. And sometimes I just like wish it didn't have to be that way, and that these things were a little more normalized, and that they weren't, um, not that they weren't, but that they didn't need to be applauded as much. I think it's great that they're applauded and they absolutely deserve recognition and attention, but it's like just with the society that we live in, I wish it did not have to be that way. So yeah.
I think that we need diversity among every single part of the ranks. When we're talking about media production, we're going to need them behind the screen and in front of the screen. And it matters not only who's being out there, but also how they're being portrayed. We need, and also I think that how they're being portrayed, relates to how we are in real life. Like we have the agency to choose what path we're on, whether that fits with the stereotypical path or not. So if you want to work as a chef, awesome, go do that. That is womanhood. If you want to go be a doctor, go do that. That is definitely part of womanhood. And so the freedom to be able to make that choice on your own, I think, is the key to being able to do that. And personally, just again, like as a person of color, I think there's so much intersectionality between identity and womanhood. But even just thinking about that question, I just like want to recognize my privilege to like think when I heard identity, I thought race. But then it made me realize like I have a lot of privilege as like a cisgender woman, to not have to think about that as one of the ambiguous parts of my identity. And so that's another conversation that I feel like we need to continue to have, is womanhood as a spectrum and gender as a spectrum. How are we being inclusive of all of those voices?
I think that's really key. I also, to like your point about having like diversity within every aspect of like production, I think it's very like easy to tell when a show has been made by like white producers and like the entire team is white, but they put a bunch of like diverse faces on the screen so that it doesn't seem as though like they're doing anything wrong, but they're still pandering towards a white audience. Because I find that like I resonate with everything that has been said thus far. I don't think that I really saw myself like reflected in a lot of the stuff that I watched and in a lot of the books that I read, because I'm a huge bookworm. But I found that like as I got older, that did start to change a little bit, but it still felt like superficial. It still felt flat for me. And then it's because I grew to realize that like the shows that I had started to watch and the movies that I was starting to watch and the books I was starting to read, they were still pandering towards like white people in a way, and it still was not meant for me. In order to do diversity correctly, you have to be mindful of who your audience is. You have I feel like it's so much more effective to make things for like those specific group of people. So like for queer Black people specifically, as opposed to like putting a show with a queer Black like lead, but having it be for a white audience.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all so much for your answers to these questions. So the next question that we're going to be talking about is, so how do your other identities relate to how you identify with womanhood? So this can be just like whatever identities you feel comfortable sharing and talking about the intersections of those within you.
I talked about this earlier, but I feel like me being a Black person, specifically like a dark skinned Black person, is it has framed a lot of the way I see like womanhood and like my gender identity specifically. I don't necessarily feel like I identify with womanhood for reasons like that I explained earlier, but I do identify with Black womanhood. And so I find that like when I'm in Black spaces, I don't necessarily think about like my gender because I feel much more comfortable being like seen as a woman and being regarded to as a woman in those spaces. But like, and I guess the same extension can be made to like people of color. But when I'm not in spaces like that, and I find I'm not in spaces like that a lot here at a predominantly white institution, I started to think about my gender identity a lot more because I'm reminded of how like there is a bit of a dissonance almost within that.
Yeah, I agree. I think when like the default notion of womanhood that comes to many people's minds is white womanhood and white cisgender womanhood. And historically, even currently thinking about the ways that white womanhood has been weaponized against communities of color and against immigrant communities, it's really hard to align yourself with that when it's been used to hurt people of your own community. So I totally understand, like, see where you're coming from. um but for me, like, I find strength like in other Asian American women too, and other women of color, because of how I think, like, very generally speaking, we there's so much strength in that community that despite all this harm that we face, there's still so much beauty in our communities. And I think that has so much to do with the fact that there are, you know, people of marginalized gender identities, like women, non-binary, gender queer people within these communities that intersect with other identities as well. um yeah.
And our last question is, what does gender equity look like to you in both broader society and at Harvard? As well as what important initiatives have you seen or believe need to happen?
I can kind of kick this one off with an experience of mine and also my roommates. Is um, She is taking a class on slave narratives that especially focuses on like narratives of women, people who were enslaved, and it's taught by a white man. And something about that just doesn't really sit right with us. So, from like a faculty's perspective, and in a lot of my classes as well, I see a lot of the like upper level, very like hard science, raw STEM courses just being taught by white men. And I find myself looking for female mentorship a lot in, especially my academics, just because, again, like science, chemistry research, it's all such a male-dominated field. So I'm really grateful to have a research mentor back home who's a very strong woman of color, very prominent in her field, and I think that's super nice. So if we could like include more of that at Harvard for just all fields, not just like the sciences, but having like equitable female representation and mentors and just role models that female students can look up to, that would be a great start.
Um, Societally, like also at Harvard, but just even bigger picture, I want a different understanding of what exactly gender is, right? After having worked at the Women's Center and learning the framework that we use here about gender as a constellation, it always frustrates me now whenever I see like very binary notions of gender, or, you know, because I there isn't one definition of manhood and one definition of womanhood, and even thinking about it as a spectrum, they don't exist as polar opposites, that, things exist in between, right? But they're super complex, and to arbitrarily decide what is woman, what is man, and what should exist in between, I think is so pointless and very harmful. um and yet we have to reconcile with the fact that, like, these notions have been made to exist and impact and have real impact on people. So um in that way, I don't have an answer for that, but at the same time, I think just a reworking of what gender even is, and having more conversations about that, and even taking smaller steps and spaces to invite people of different genders and have them label themselves, asking people what their pronouns is at the beginning of a semester, right? That's one really super easy to implement kind of step that goes a long way for a lot of people. So yeah, I like, societally speaking, a reworking of gender, but even smaller steps to really have that practice put into place is also super manageable.
I also think that like one big step that I feel needs to be taken in order for us to truly achieve gender equity is understanding the role that like violence plays, and especially violence towards women of color, because a lot of us sit at the we all sit at the intersection of like racial and gendered violence, and even more so for people who don't identify as cis women. I feel like on college campuses specifically it can be very hard to navigate through that, especially since I feel like a lot of these campuses like breed environments in which sexual assault is not like dealt with in the ways that it should be, and that then just like extrapolates into like greater society, because um, the same attitudes persist. If you were in college and you thought that the things that you were doing there were okay and you continue to do that, when you leave college, like it just creates it just continues on, and no one ever holds like people accountable in the way that they should. um, and so I feel like we won't ever truly gain a sense of gender equity if that's never addressed.
Even at Harvard here, I feel like gender equity has such a long way to go. I feel like people often talk about look how far we've come, but I think it is important to talk about where are we going from here. Um, I also know that like now there are actually like it's about 60% um, of the people in college are identify as women, and which is amazing, but also then we have to look at where are these positions? What positions are they getting out of college? Because we still have that gender pay gap. That has not gone away. So I think that we need to take our little wins, I guess, and but like we can't forget about the big picture, and we can't forget about the relationships along the way. And so I think that there are a lot of aspects of gender equity that need to be addressed on all fronts.
All right, y'all. That was incredible. I think you all deserve a round of applause. That was really awesome. Thank you so much.
All right.
Thank you so much, y'all, for sharing your stories. We really appreciated hearing them. And to our listeners, thank you so much for tuning in. Feel free to email us at hcwcintern@gmail.com with more podcast ideas, and make sure to follow us at HCWC Women of Color Collective on Instagram for updates on what we have planned next.